from Jerusalem. Welcome to Beit. We're happy to host once again Dr. Katherine Aron, who is a lecturer at Tel Aviv University and also Hebrew University here in Jerusalem. This four-part series will take us to Italy and will follow the lives of Jews during the Renaissance through art and through history. So, Kathy, we're ready to go to Italy with you.
Hi, everybody. It's great to have you with me. I'm excited to have you with me on this journey. So welcome to my first session on Jews in the Italian Renaissance. Our 4-session series course will begin today with looking at the two very different waves of immigration of Jews that occurred in central and northern Italy between the 13th and the 16th centuries. Once we've understood these two waves, we will turn to a definition of the Italian Renaissance. We will question whether this cultural revolution might lead Italian Jews to be more tolerant, Italian Christians to be more tolerant of Jews, and also if the Renaissance will affect Jewish intellectual, religious, and cultural development. All this will be in preparation of our future sessions, where we will delve into this topic of the Italian Renaissance and the Jews in greater depth. Let me start by saying that the history of Italian Jews is unique in the history of Europe. Here they fared better than their brethren. The Jews of Rome, of course, represented the oldest Jewish community in the Western world. A Jewish colony existed in Rome, the Eternal City, 200 years before the birth of Jesus, and Jewish life of sorts continued there ever since. An imaginative and perhaps apocryphal etymology even translates the word Italy into Hebrew as Italia, or island of divine dew. Of course, this allows for popular Jewish tradition to note that the earliest Jews who settled in Italy and searched for an answer to their good fortune for finding such a place to live in found it in the very name of the country. So let us turn to the first wave of immigration, which we will call Stage 1, occurring from the 13th century with the creation of hundreds of new small Jewish communities in the towns and villages of the northern peninsula. And then we have a second stage from the 16th centuries, another wave in which Jews enter the main Italian states, most of which they had never lived before, and are usually quickly placed in Jewish quarters that become known as ghettos. Throughout my talk and throughout all my course, Rome remains the exception because Jews, as I said before, had continually lived there. Here you see the image of what we think was the site of the old medieval synagogue in Trastevere. And we will reflect on what is happening to our Jews as we move forward during this period. So let us start by remembering that Italy during the early modern period is nothing more than a geographical expression. That is, it wasn't united politically during the period that we are speaking about. And one could easily imagine the extent to which it constituted a distinct cultural unit. Some parts were united politically with powers outside of Italy, some of southern Italy with Spain, some of northern Italy with Germany. Italians of the period very frequently think of themselves primarily as citizens of one or another of the city-states, as Florentines, as Milanese, as Romans, as Venetians, or Modernese. Being Italian is likely to be a secondary or even a tertiary, a third-level identification for them. From the time of the Roman Empire and in the first 10 centuries of the Middle Ages, that is approximately until around 1350, almost all Italian Jews lived in the southern part of the peninsula, from Rome and downwards into Sicily. But 200 years later, around 1550, Jewish settlements were all in central and northern Italy, besides Rome. How come? What happened? I'd like to follow this immigration of Jews into the towns of these dynamic duchies and republics in stage 1. And then I will mention the Jews' final absorption into the city capitals themselves, such as Venice and Florence. The circumstances provide a key to the extraordinary capacity demonstrated by these northern Italian states to protect their own Jews, refusing to expel them, as other European kingdoms did during this turbulent period. So let's start with stage one. What motivated Jews to move to central and northern Italy in the late medieval period, and why were they accepted by these states? The latter part of the 13th century was the beginning of a key period in the history of Italian Jewry. It ceased to be purely that of the Jews of Rome and southern Italy. The growth of new communities, which archival documentation shows to have been surprisingly rapid and widespread, had its origin in the northward migration from Rome of Jewish merchants engaged in the money trade. In the course of the 14th century, the vicissitudes of Rome, including the so-called Babylon captivity of the papacy in Avignon, was such as to reinforce the tendency towards the decision of Jews to leave Rome. Jewish owners of capital were attracted to the cities of north-central Italy, where conditions were more favorable to the practice of money lending. Single Jews or small groups of Jews, perhaps a family nucleus consisting of as many as 10 or 15 individuals, whereas two families could include 20 or 30 people, moved from Rome along the great consular road towards the town of central and northern Italy. And here they were invited by the rulers of these small communes to open loan banks and invest their capital on the local credit markets alongside or as a substitute for that of the great Tuscan or Lombard companies. And the history of the assertion between the 1300s and the 1500s of these bankers, who were often also scholars, doctors, and rabbis, constitutes one of the most fascinating themes in the history of Italian Jewry. And this wave of migration spread rapidly through Latium, Umbria, the Marches, and Tuscany, as you see here, creating communities in areas where Jews had never previously settled, or where their appearance had hitherto been brief or sporadic. And these communities had many features in common and developed a vigorous cultural, religious, and also to some degree linguistic identity, which was to persist over time. We know that these Jews ended up speaking Judeo-Italian, which was a language which incorporated Hebrew words not easily translated into Italian, but also introducing words and idiomatic expressions from the countries from which they came. In short, a Christian would have no trouble recognizing a Jew by his manner of talking, even if he dressed the same as a Christian. And the first mention of a Jew living in a small town not far from Rome was actually in Sermonetta in 1294. Today, it still has a medieval house that some believe was a synagogue, although this cannot, unfortunately, be proven. But Jews did not just come from Rome. They also came from France, they came from Germany. The French Jews, for the most part, were refugees expelled from northern France in 1394, whereas the German Jews were mostly victims of the persecutions that came in the wake of the terrible Black Plague of 1348. They came down from the north in a slow but continuous stream. What drove these Jews to move into northern Italy? So obviously, if you're expelled, you have no choice. But in some instances, that in those leaving from Rome, the motive may have been the pure and simple quest for adventure. a migration made in the hopes of finding better living conditions in a chosen destination rather than in one's place of origin. And this seems to have been an everyday affair. And the Jews were not the only ones to display this behavior. These northern Italian city-states were attractive, certainly more so than Rome to many Christians. These northern Italian states were experiencing a phase of expansion and economic development, which exhibited also a relatively liberal policy with regard to the granting of citizenship, of a share, that is, in the rights and protection enjoyed by their own citizens. And these circumstances therefore confirm the extraordinary capacity demonstrated by the Italian states at the end of the Middle Ages to make the most of their human resources and allow themselves to expand. And seen in this perspective, the migratory movements of the Jews are perhaps one of the typical expressions of the Jews' own participation in the spirit of the time. An ability to understand supply and demand, and the opportunities to integrate into the new locations in the Italian peninsula. In terms of this whole period, it is possible to estimate the number of Jews. We think that these small communities probably numbered between 15,000 and 20,000 Jews altogether, or approximately 0.2% of the population as a whole. A nice example for us is the famous town of Assisi in Perugia, part of the Papal State, probably hosted a Jewish population of 80 to 100 Jews in the second half of the 14th century, and current research suggests that this was a substantial number of Jews for any community at the time. It enabled not just individual rabbis to teach and serve these Jews, but also a rabbinical court that had jurisdiction over Jews in surrounding areas. In many northern Italian archives, one can encounter the records of the deliberation of the citizen councils testifying, confirming for us to the position of a Hebrew community in the town, as well as the so-called capitula, that is, those documents that contain the rules about the presence of Jews in a small or a big town, also from the 14th century, and eventually condotte, that is, banking contracts, usually 15th and 16th centuries, special permission for travelers, Jews who had to travel as merchants, moneylenders, physicians, and rabbis. And if we look at the Duchy of Milan too, whose lands consisted of the lands of Lombardy between the Adda and the Ticino, with the cities of Parma and Piacenza to the south, and Valtellina and the country of Bellinzona in the north, the Milanese duchy changed hands consistently through this period, but Jews were assigned to a conservatore, a governor official in charge of the Jews, and the podesta, or the mayor of each town, offered protection of the Jews. And such towns as we see here, Cremona, Vigevano, Como, Alessandria, Bavia, Piacenza, Laudi, Crema, Castel Maggiore, Casalazzo, and Serravalle were all filled with Jews. And at this time, we think about 300 Jews spread over the duchy. So the question also becomes, what are the Jews looking for? The choice of a place for them to settle was strongly influenced, I think, by two slightly contradictory factors. On the one hand, the best possibilities for financial prosperity existed where other Jews had not yet settled. In other words, where one had no fear of competition from other Jewish moneylenders. Preference was clearly given to a locality defended by a solid wall, like Verona, whether it be a small town or a castle. Wars were frequent, And everybody knew from experience that combatant troops made up of mercenaries considered it their right to put conquered cities to the sack. And Jews were even more vulnerable than the Christians because they were moneylenders and had ready cash on hand, which was the main thing plunderers were looking for. Why were these Italian towns and villages interested in admitting Jews? Well, I think also there are a few reasons here. The Jews are more willing than anyone else to accept restrictive conditions imposed on them with regard to interest rates and the like. They also made far more profitable, taxable subjects than most. And of course, they did not represent a source of potential political danger to the ruling forces, as might have been the case with other minorities. So the argument most frequently used by these communes was that the Jews were necessary. What did this word mean, necessary, or they were needed? Bearing in mind the Franciscan campaigns against usurers. The Franciscans were mendicant orders who didn't like the idea that people were involving themselves with money lending. And one really has to think more about this idea of the Jews being moneylenders. In Lombardy, for example, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the first Duke of Milan, invited Jews to open their banks in Cremona, in Pavia, in Como, and Vigevano, as you see here. Another example is Padua in the Venetian Republic. With its international university and a big population of chronically penniless students, Padua had a substantial demand for the service of moneylenders, and Jews eventually came to contribute to them. Verona, which at this time is part of the Venetian Republic, invited German Jews to their town in 1408, apparently hoping thereby to reduce the extortionate charges of Christian lenders. Also in Vicenza, in the same republic, some Jews from central Italy probably arrived in the town in the second half of the 14th century, and here small traders seem to have preceded bankers. So let's just think for a moment what some of these banks would have looked like. Quite often, the bank was located in a building adapted for this purpose, but not infrequently it amounted to little more than an ad hoc stall set up in a marketplace or its near vicinity. And we have the wonderful descriptions of the book of the moneylender and the borrower, written anonymously in Hebrew in the 15th century by a knowledgeable physician who was deeply erudite in halachic literature in the style of Maimonides' code of his Mishnah Torah. And he has given us this invaluable sketch of the bank as it was perceived through Jewish eyes. The bank was supposed to be plainly visible, but at the same time sufficiently out of the public eye, both present and absent. So firstly, he talks about the location of the bank and what it should look like from the outside. And this is the translation from the Hebrew. The building must be strong and constructed in stone so that outlaws cannot get inside under cover of darkness. It must not have many doors and windows so as not to be exposed to the danger of burglary. The windows must be protected by gratings anchored to the walls as the top and bottom. The bank must be located in the best section of the city, close to the central crossroads, so that it is easy to reach, but off the main street, away from the market square, so that rich people aren't ashamed to be seen going in. The entrance must be low and narrow, protected by a curtain to stop passers-by seeing in, so they don't recognize the face of those taking out a loan. The curtain must be blue, so that the banker is easily recognizable. And now, a description of the interior of the bank. Inside the bank must be several doors and windows so that it is well illuminated and it is possible to tell the good man from the bad. The windows, however, should be sealed with paper or with oiled parchment if the banker is poor, or with glass if he is rich, to keep out drafts, because they could affect the functioning of the weighing scales. The counter must be in the middle and must stretch the room from one side to the other, completely separating the moneylender from his customers. It should be wide and deep so that the inner edge is out of the customer's reach. The bank then should be so constructed as to ensure that moneylender and customers are separated and maintain a respectable distance from each other. I think this is a wonderful description that shows us how the banker can be protected from his client, and that there should be this clear distinction and possibility to stand back and see who is approaching him and wanting money. However, the Jews were not always moneylenders. Sometimes they were physicians. On many occasions, we see one Jew being both a financier, a moneylender, and a physician at the same time. And when a Jew was both a moneylender and a doctor, he was always active in the town's credit sector, investing his capital, large or small, in loans to the commune and to private individuals. But even if a Jew was a physician without being a moneylender, there were still privileges and prestige which his position would bring. These doctors might be able to acquire property and enter into the town's land register, perhaps exemption from payment of city tributes, special taxes, authorization, even allowing them to carry defensive weapons. Jewish doctors in general were professionally trained, sometimes better trained than the majority of their Christian colleagues. We even know that one Musetto de Giulimo was a professor of medicine at the University of Perugia, teaching there between 1413 and 1417. But we do see Jews taking other professions as well. In Spoleto, in Perugia, Jewish occupations were more varied. They were affluent cloth merchants, and in Cascia, they were dealers in valuable saffron who traveled the trade route of central Italy, like other merchants, leased space to store their goods and to stable their horses. In Assisi, Jews acted as tailors, pharmacists, ironmongers, innkeepers, tavern keepers, fullers, dyers, experts in arm manufacture and the production of gunpowder. Many Jews also became involved in the publishing business in the later 15th century. The invention of printing gave many of them a chance to combine intellectual activity with capital investment or manual labor. And from the second half of the 15th century to the first decades of the 16th, the Jews flung themselves enthusiastically into this new occupation. A by no means negligible number of the incunambulas published in Italy were composed and then printed in Hebrew. We also hear about Jews who were well respected and skilled craftsmen. Dattilo de Benedetto, a master goldsmith in the district of Porta Ubernia in Perugia, had his shop in the market square near this church of Santa Maria and was recorded in the land registers of 1366. So that's the first level, the first wave of immigration. Now we turn to the onset of our second wave of immigration that will lead to ghettoization. Between the end of the 15th century and the first decades of the 16th, close to 50,000 Jews lived across Italy. Obviously, the big cities were going to be attractive to our Jews, not only for economic opportunities they offered, but also because Jews could be part of bigger Jewish communities. Safety in numbers. Not only that, but I think the number of Jews in Italy at the end of the 15th century was to swell because of the expulsions of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, the arrival of Spanish refugees in Italy, along with the disappearance of the settlement of Jews in the south, including Sicily, where Jews were expelled in 1492. But what is important to note is that unlike the Middle Ages, the expulsion of Jews from Spain created multi-ethnic Jewish communities in a lot of centers in Europe. This was new. It was exceedingly rare during the Middle Ages to have two separate ethnic communities of Jews in the same place. In the Middle Ages, there were Spanish Jews in Spain, German Jews in Germany. In Greece, there were Greek Jews, Egyptian Jews in Egypt, Hungarian Jews in Hungary, Italian Jews in Italy, and so on. But it was this wave of expulsions after 1492 that really changed the situation. When Jews went from one country to another, they adapted themselves to the Jewish ways and customs of their new home. But in many places, the Spanish immigrants outnumbered the local Jews and did not want to adapt to the older customs of the place. So in many places, there might be three groups of Jews in Italy: Spanish, German, and local, none of them willing to relinquish their ancestral ways. In other places, it was the German Jews who put their stamp on things. Rome, for instance, had three separate groups: Ashkenazi Jews, Spanish Jews, and what was known as the Italian, the real Italians who had been there for centuries. The city of Mantua would, from the 16th century, have two kinds of synagogues, just Ashkenazic and Italian. And Rabbi Azriel Diener, in his responsa in the 1520s, also talks about French Jews, who apparently did not have their own synagogue, but had their own customs. And when we look at the big city-states and republics, we see Jews entering these territories only now from the 16th century. Why now? Well, I think there was an initial reluctance on the part of Italian city governments to allow Jews to take up residence permanently in the main cities, as if the presence of Jewish usurers somehow contaminated the civic community. The Jews had only been given permission to establish themselves in small towns or villages within range of the big city, and people were expected to go out to them there, so that travel costs were added to interest charges. For example, Jews in the Venetian Republic were confined to towns in what was known as the terra firma, the mainland of Italy, and particularly in Mestre, the nearest town on the mainland, throughout the 15th century, as well as Verona, Padua, and Vicenza, as I have mentioned. And from here they would cross into Venice for short periods of time to attend auctions of pledges. In fact, Jews were only admitted to Venice permanently in and after 1509, when the Veneto was invaded by the League of Cambrai, and in response to the preaching of the friars, all Jewish settlers were ordered into the ghetto in 1516. So this is our phase 2, the absorption of Jews into the city-states of Italy. I don't think that this represented a deterioration in the status of the Jews, but rather the opposite. Ghettoization will become the phenomena in Italy from the 16th century onwards. These quarters came to represent a kind of middle ground between unconditional acceptance, which was unthinkable in the early modern period in a Catholic land, and expulsion. For those who wish to see less of the Jews, the ghetto, while not really hindering Jewish mobility during the day, definitely relegated them to the northern fringe of the city by night. Yet it also made possible the emergence of a public official Jewish community in Venice where none had existed previously. And the same thing happens in Florence. So in fact, in the 16th century, we stumble upon a fascinating phenomenon. The Jews who had been living in peripheral cities and towns in these Italian states are finally from this time allowed to enter the glittering city-state capitals, but under very specific conditions. And this is our stage 2. Between the early 16th century and the late 18th, northern and central Italy established by law approximately 39 ghettos, 39 areas where all practicing Jews were compelled to reside. I want to stop here because I feel that we have a beginning and an end to our 4-week session in time, in terms of time, from the 14th to the 16th century. But in order to finish setting the scene, we now need to think more about what the Italian Renaissance was that Jews were experiencing during this time. The Renaissance is a French word that was coined by the French historian Jules Michelet and expanded upon by the Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt in the 19th century, and it literally means rebirth. And rebirth is used in 2 ways. First, it means rediscovery of ancient classical texts and learning, and their application in the arts and the sciences. This was a return to classic Latin style and vocabulary, away from medieval Latin, and perhaps more striking, certainly more sudden, there was the rediscovery of the Greek language, which had not been taught in Western Europe since the Dark Ages. Second, it means that the results of these intellectual activities created this revitalization of European culture in general. And so it's possible to speak of the Italian Renaissance in 2 different but meaningful ways. A rebirth of classic learning and knowledge through the rediscovery of ancient texts, and a rebirth of European culture in general. Think of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, an example of the blend of art and science during the Renaissance. The predominant view is that the Renaissance of the 15th century in Italy, spreading through the rest of Europe, represented this reconnection of the West with classical antiquity. The absorption of knowledge, particularly mathematics from Arabic, the return of experimentalism, the focus on the importance of living well in the present, and that is humanism, an explosion of the dissemination of knowledge brought on by printing, and of course the creation of new techniques in art, in poetry, in architecture, which led to this radical change in the style and substance of arts and letters. This period then represents Europe emerging from a long period as a backwater and the rise of commerce and exploration. The Italian Renaissance is often labeled as the beginning of the modern epoch. But not surprisingly, Marxist and socialist historians view the Renaissance as a pseudo-revolution with changes in art, literature, and philosophy, affecting only a tiny minority of the very wealthy and powerful. While life, they say, for the great mass of the European population was unchanged from the Middle Ages. But that, I think, does not deny that it was an event of much import. Today, in general, most historians view the Renaissance as largely an intellectual and ideological change rather than a substantive one. And perhaps the most important determinant of the Renaissance is that those involved in it believed that they were living in a new era that was a clean break from the past. And I think this has to be important just in itself. So I want to start by saying that the Renaissance has no set starting point or place. And this is an important point when we think of the Renaissance period in relation to the Jews. From the point of view of art history, 1300 is probably too early, and 1650 is way too late, well into the period of Baroque art. Renaissance art, if you go to a gallery or a museum, probably doesn't go past, I would say, around 1525. Michelangelo's late artwork, late sculpture that you see here is already edging towards the distortion of perspective. And surely, I would argue, we can't go past 1600. But somehow, as you all know, the term Renaissance is very much entwined with the study of art. But I am a historian, and I tend to think of history not only in terms of visual arts, but also written records. The starting place of the Renaissance is most universally ascribed to northern Italy, especially the city of Florence. One early Renaissance figure is the poet Dante, the first writer to embody the spirit of the Renaissance. Francesco Petrarch is another early Renaissance figure. Petrarch was an Italian scholar, poet, and one of the earliest Renaissance humanists. He's often popularly called the father of humanism. And based on Petrarch's work, and to a lesser extent on that of Dante and Giovanni Boccaccio, Pietro Dembo in the 16th century created the model for the modern Italian language. But let's go back to Petrarch for a second. Petrarch is credited with perfecting the sonnet, making it one of the most popular art forms to date. And as part of the humanist movement, he concluded that the height of human accomplishment had been reached in the Roman Empire, and that the ages since that golden period had been periods of social rot, which he labeled the Dark Ages. And Petrarch saw history as social, art, and literary advancement, and not as a series of set religious events. Rebirth meant the rediscovery of ancient Rome and Greek Latin heritage through ancient manuscripts and the humanist method of learning. Another possible starting point is the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. It was a turning point in warfare as cannon and gunpowder became a central element. In addition, of course, Eastern scholars fled west into Italy, bringing renewed energy and interest of the Greek heritage, and it perhaps represents the end of the old religious order in Europe. Let's turn now a bit more to the location of the Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance was intertwined with the intellectual movement known as Renaissance humanism, and with the fiercely independent and combative urban societies of the city-states of northern Italy in the 13th to the 16th centuries. The first 2 or 3 decades of the 15th century saw the emergence of a rare cultural effervescence, particularly in Florence. This Florentine Enlightenment was a major achievement. It was a classical, classicizing culture which sought to live up to the republican ideals of Athens and Rome. Sculptors used Roman models and classical themes. This society had a new relationship with its classical past. It felt it owned it and revived it. Florentines felt akin to first century Republican Romans. There was a genuine appreciation of the plastic arts, pagan idols and statuary, with nudity, expressions of human dignity, etc., etc. Sculpture was also revived, in many cases before the other arts. And there was a very obvious naturalism about contemporary sculpture, and highly, truly to life figures were being sculpted. Often biblically themed sculpture and paintings included recognizable Florentines. And from here, the Renaissance spread north out of Italy, being adapted and modified as it moved. From France, the spirit of the age spread to the Low Countries and to Germany, and finally to England and Scandinavia by the late 16th century. In these areas, the Renaissance became closely linked to the turmoil of the Protestant Reformation, and the art and writing of the German Renaissance frequently reflected this dispute as well. While Renaissance ideas were moving north from Italy, there was a simultaneous spread southward of innovation, particularly in music and theatre. The music of the 15th century Burgundian school defined the beginning of the Renaissance in the art of music. And the polyphony, that is the musical texture consisting of two or more independent melodic voices of the Netherlanders, as it moved with the musicians themselves into Italy, formed the core of what was the first true international style in music since the standardization of the Gregorian chant in the 9th century. There had also been, until that time, medieval theatre, miracle plays, for example. But Renaissance playwrights returned to the style of the ancient playwrights, such as Seneca, Virgil, and Titus Plautus. Greek playwrights had delved into comedy, and again, Italy was its new home. It started in Italy in the 1500s, just shortly before it gets to London. In England, the Elizabethan era marked the beginning of the English Renaissance. It saw writers such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, John Milton, and Edmund Spenser, as well as great artists and architects such as Inigo Jones, and composers such as Thomas Tallis, John Tavener, and William Byrd, whose music was played yesterday during the coronation of King Charles III. I want to finish this section with a rather truistic statement, but one that I believe is important. We've spoken so far about art and literature equaling ancient culture. But I suggest we need to take this idea one step further. In the Renaissance, artists and literary figures surpassed their Greek and Roman predecessors. Michelangelo is often suggested as being the greatest artist who ever lived, and certainly was a more impressive sculptor than the Greeks who he learnt from. Christopher Columbus had clearly done something that Greeks and Romans had not done and perhaps could not have done. Galileo also surpassed Greek astronomy, and so on. One of the overwhelming realities of the Middle Ages is that they lived in the shadow of a civilization whose accomplishments they could not equal. But Renaissance Italy breaks out of that. There is a newness here, a developed progress in all forms of life that has to be recognized. And so, we need to start considering whether too we can expect great things for our Jews. There's also one more thing I want to suggest. Perhaps this isn't really spoken about too much, but I think also we should remember that in many ways, Renaissance humanists turn their back on Christianity. What does that mean? Well, if we think of two of the most famous figures of the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci and Shakespeare, we should note that neither of them were really Christians. They were pagans. So therefore, the Renaissance was this revival of secular and a pagan outlook on life. And let me just show you a little more evidence on this point. I will mention three figures that really stand out. The first is Niccolò Machiavelli, who lived in Florence. His work, The Prince, argues that kings or rulers who are good Christians will lead themselves and their states into ruin. They will be beaten by other scrupulous rulers. And as a result, Niccolò Machiavelli inaugurated the project of modern secular political science, which is the study not of saints and saintliness, but of politics and successful politicians. The second figure worth mentioning was Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, also 16th century. He was notorious for his loose morals, his utterly cynical use of papal power for personal gain. And it's questionable, I think, whether he was any more Christian than Machiavelli. The third figure, an earlier one, was Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio was this writer, a generation after Dante, a writer of stories. The stories were collected in a work called the Decameron. Was he a Christian? Well, his stories were secular, their morality dubious. To what extent, then, was his worldview or his ethos shaped by Christianity? And to what extent was it shaped by his reading and training in the ancient Greek and Roman values? Today, I've given you many names and many ideas. But what we can see is that the notion of the Renaissance as pagan and secular sets up some expectations, especially for what Jews will extract from such a cultural revolution. Medieval Christianity had alienated Jews and Judaism and often persecuted them. For me, it is this image of ecclesia and synagogue that in many ways represents that alienation of Jews. Here you see ecclesia on the left hand of the image, standing high. She represents the church, and she's standing high. She's holding a chalice and a goblet, and she's standing upright. On the other side, and these images come from the entrance of the Notre Dame Cathedral, you see synagogue, whose eyes have been covered by a snake that is wrapped around her head. She has a staff that is broken, and you will see at the bottom her crown has fallen down. These were the images that we have of Jews in the medieval period. Judaism is outdated. Synagogue is blindfolded. She can't see the truth. And ecclesia is the one who will lead people into the future. So what I'm saying is that we come from this tradition in particular where Judaism is thought of as a very inferior religion. Could we expect then Renaissance Italians to be more tolerant? Would not such an educated group of people be skeptical of anti-Judaic ideas that had been set in the medieval period? Or let me put this differently. Columbus had discovered Columbus had discovered America. The Renaissance artists, writers, and thinkers, Dante, Boccaccio, Machiavelli, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, discovered man. The Renaissance discovered what people are really like, how they really behave, how they really talk, how they really feel. So can we not expect the Renaissance to change the Christian perception and treatment of Jews? From segregation towards integration, and from persecution towards tolerance. Plus, as I show you here, I think we have two very important conditions that are present during the Renaissance. The first thing is that non-Jews are generally well disposed towards Jews, definitely notwithstanding this marginal opposition from ecclesiastical and competitive economic circles. Second of all, Jews are largely well disposed towards their non-Jewish culture. So what we're seeing here, and I hope you'll agree with me, is this opening, this possibility that the two can actually interact with each other in ways that have not been seen before this. Could this not then have changed Judaism too? And we also need to think about something else. If we are looking at the Renaissance as a cultural revolution, would Jews definitely be susceptible to a cultural revolution, just as such as the Renaissance, because they are living in Italy? Jews have lived in many different places. Were they always affected by what was happening culturally in the places where they lived? And in answering this question, I really have one point. I suggest that the history of the Jews in a given country is organically linked to the general history of that country. The Jewish nation is part of the general history of that country. For whatever contingency affects the non-Jews there is going to affect their Jewish neighbors at the same time. And these currents of thought and art and feeling could hardly have gone unnoticed among Jews. And I have another question that I'd like you to think about till we meet again. I want you to keep this in mind. What is the influence of the skepticism that I've shown, of the tolerance that I've shown, of the secularity that I've shown, and the paganism on the Jews in early modern Italy? Will we not find among the Jews in Renaissance Italy some inkling, some foreshadowing of this more modern outlook and world? The Jews' response to the Renaissance will begin in our next class together as we turn to the topic of their new intellectual pursuits, humanism, mysticism, and the false messiahs of the period. So let's just conclude what we've spoken about today. I've shown you, I hope clearly, how we're looking at two waves of integration of Jews into northern Italy. At first, definitely a slower one. The Jews are checking, making sure, being those traditional moneylenders that they've been elsewhere, but confident because they have the security of charters from these various areas and where they settle, that they have a legal right to be there and that they are being protected. So that begins with the 13th century. And this continues, as I tried to show you, until the 16th century, where in Venice, which is our first ghetto, we have a new way of thinking about the Jews, that they're actually going to be important, their money lending facilities are going to grow, and there's a sense to which let's bring them in to the main city centers, definitely put them in the ghetto, and we know that they stay there for centuries. That period, from the 13th to the 16th, is also the period when the Renaissance is happening in this whole world of where the Jews live. And it will be my intention over the next few weeks to show you what the Jews take from Christian society. What are they confident to take? How do they develop their own ideas of humanism, their own ideas of education? Some of these concepts of what's happening in the humanist schools is going to excite the Jews, and we'll see Jews absorbing these ideas. We also have to think about artwork as well. How do Jews develop their own artwork, because there is such a proliferation and creativity going on in the world around them? How do they express that, but keep it within a Jewish framework? And finally, in our last lecture, we will turn, of course, to the question that really fascinates us, I think, always. Where were the Jewish women? Do they too have their own renaissance? Do they too have a change in their life that is affected by this openness? And what we have to do when we're looking at this is not just to think about the Jews in the Jewish community, the Jewish women in the community, but what's happening to Christian women? Are they having their own revolution? Because if they're having their own revolution, perhaps we can expect the Jewish women to have those too. So it's an interesting and wonderful opportunity for me to be here and to teach you this. And I look forward to meeting with you again next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Kathy. We do have 1 or 2 questions, and if these are issues which you're going to answer in the next session, so you can tell us to wait patiently. So what's a question regarding the money lenders? How did Jews have access to so much free money, ready cash?
It's a wonderful question. We'll look more of this a little bit later. Basically, they would keep their money in liquid form. That was just something that they were known to do. And also remember, these are families that can often borrow from each other. So we do see that happening as well. In general, what we know is that Jews did that. They kept it in liquid form. They would be really, and they would, when they would lend money, they would often sort of promises from Christians and sureties that they would pay back at certain times. But it seemed to be something that was continuing, and as their banks grew bigger and the Jews collectively did this more often, they had more access to more liquid cash.
This is another question regarding art. We know that during the 17th century, Rembrandt painted pictures of Jews. Is there something similar in the Renaissance of paintings of Jews?
There was a Christian painter who painted Jews. Well, we'll be looking a little bit at that, but that's not really the angle that we need to take. What we need to do is look at the Hebrew illuminated manuscripts themselves, because these are the Jews' own objects, and what they're painting in these pictures as a way of understanding what they're depicting and what they're feeling, what they're being influenced by. We don't really have a Christian artist in this period who goes into Italy, into even the ghettos and draws Jews. That's not really part of the situation that we have in Italy.
Okay, I think we're all looking forward to next week and to go a little deeper into the subject. Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you everyone for joining us. Good evening from Jerusalem.